Hello and welcome to the 8th episode of Beneath the Shadows. I am your host, Travis Fenn, recording today, as always, from the comfort of the Shadow Realm, my office studio located here in Ypsilanti, Michigan. When I say office studio, it's just a home studio, nothing like crazy, but my office studio located here in Ypsilanti, Michigan. I'd like to start off, as always, by saying thank you so fucking much. You're all great. You're wonderful people, and I appreciate you being here. Thank you for checking out the show. Thank you for taking the time to rate and review. If you have not, please get over there and give me 5 stars. Let me know what you love about the show. The feedback is immensely helpful, and the positivity is always inspiring. I'd like to take a moment to make some updates regarding the show. I've got some social media pages up for the show. This includes Instagram and TikTok, along with Patreon, that I will be releasing shorter episodes on 10 to 15 minute episodes. I will be releasing 10 to 15 minute episodes, maybe 20 minute episodes on every other week to start. The next one comes out this Thursday, the 24th. So please check those out if you have not. The first couple will be free, and then after that, it's only $3 a month. $3 a month for a couple extra episodes. I really appreciate anyone who can support me. It means so much, and it really makes my fucking day. So thank you so much. The name on those pages is Beneath the Shadows on Patreon and Beneath the Shadows Podcast on Instagram and TikTok. And this also includes a Gmail address, so send email updates, topic suggestions, or anything you'd like to beneaththeshadowspodcast@gmail.com. And with that little bit of housekeeping, little tidying up all done, I'd say it's about time we dive into today's episode. Today, we look at the United States National Parks and the National Park System's history since the 19th century. We will take a look at how they became established and when particular acts occurred and parks opened during the 152 years since the first park was designated. Some of my favorite places I've ever been to in the United States are national parks, and they provide a slice of nature for the public that can be harder and harder to find in the world today. So get out, go live life, go enjoy some beautiful, majestic, and downright immaculate scenery. Go hike, bike, climb, raft, kayak, or do one of the endless amount of activities available at America's national parks. It may just change your life. You never know. The roots of the national park idea date back to the 19th century. In 1832, artist George Catlin was the first to advocate for protecting natural areas and indigenous culture, inspired by his travels in the American West. So really quick, let's talk about George Catlin, who is definitely not to be confused with famous comedian George Carlin. Pretty close. If my life be spared, nothing shall stop me from visiting every nation of Indians on the continent of North America. With these words, George Catlin staked his artistic claim. He was the first great painter to travel beyond the Mississippi to paint the natives, and his gallery, staggering in its ambition and scope, is one of the wonders of the 19th century. Catlin was just 7 years old in 1803 when Thomas Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark on a 3-year expedition to explore the newly acquired Louisiana Purchase. In 1830, Catlin made his initial pilgrimage to St. Louis to meet William Clark and learn from him all he could of the western lands he hoped to visit. He would have only a short time to accomplish his goal, to capture with canvas and paint the essence of Indian life and culture. In the same year, the Indian Removal Act commenced the 12-year action that would remove the Indians from land east of the Mississippi. Within a few years, the Mandan, Mandan, would be decimated by smallpox. Within a few decades, the number of buffalo would drop from millions to a few thousand, and the high prairies would be cross-hatched by the plow and the railroad. When he undertook his first journey, George Catlin turned his back on his first career as a Philadelphia lawyer and his second as a miniaturist. Miniaturist? Making small shit is what he was doing. In 1832, he traveled more than 1,800 miles up the Missouri. In 1832, he traveled more than 1,800 miles up the Missouri River from St. Louis. By the decade's end, he had painted more than 500 portraits, scenes, and landscapes, and accumulated an astonishing collection of native artifacts. He had exhibited his collection in major American cities, and in 1839 he crossed the Atlantic to display his gallery in London, and eventually Paris and Brussels as well. Not merely a painter, Catlin also considered himself a scientist, explorer, author, and entrepreneur. While touring with his gallery, he fell so deeply in debt that he almost lost his entire collection. His compulsion to continue was so strong, though, that he recreated more than 400 paintings and undertook further travels to paint 200 additional images covering North and South America. He believed that his gallery was a national treasure, worthy of preservation by the United States government. Though he did not live to see his wish fulfilled, the original gallery came to the Smithsonian 7 years after his death in 1872. I believe he passed in 65, so in 72 is when it came to the Smithsonian. Moving forward, in 1864, President Abraham Lincoln granted the Yosemite Valley and Mariposa Grove to California for preservation, an important precursor to the national park movement. The Yellowstone National Park Act was signed into law on March 1st, 1872 by President Ulysses S. Grant, establishing the world's first true national park, which was Yellowstone, obviously. It withdrew more than 2 million acres of the public domain in the Montana and Wyoming territories from settlement, occupancy, or sale to be, quote, dedicated and set apart as a public park or pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people, end quote. It placed the park under the control of the Secretary of the Interior and gave the Secretary responsibility for preserving all timber, mineral deposits, geologic wonders, and other resources within the park. The establishment of the park set a precedent for placing other natural reserves under federal jurisdiction. It would take almost 2 decades until another national park was designated. In 1890, 2 national parks would be established. Those parks are 2 of the most popular parks in California today, Sequoia and Yosemite. Yosemite receives nearly 4 million annual visitors, while Sequoia sees almost 1 million. Following the formation of these 2 parks, Mount Rainier in Washington was created in 1899. Subsequently, another pair of parks would be formed before the Antiquities Act was signed in 1906, Crater Lake of Oregon in 1902, and South Dakota's Wind Cave in 1903. The Antiquities, in a sentence, I can't say it. The Antiquities Act, of 1906 was signed on June 8th of 1906. I almost said July, that's why I kind of drew out June there. It was signed by President Theodore Roosevelt, who was an avid outdoorsman and supporter of the national parks idea, and grew out of a movement to protect the prehistoric cliff dwellings, Pueblo ruins, and early missions in the Southwest. The Anasazi, I believe is how you say it, natives, made most of these pueblos and different cliff dwellings. It authorized presidents to proclaim and reserve historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic or scientific interest on lands owned or controlled by the United States as national monuments. It also prohibited the excavation or appropriation of antiquities on federal lands without permission from the department having jurisdiction. Nearly a quarter of the units currently in the National Park System originated in whole or part from the Antiquities Act. This act would lend itself directly to the creation of Mesa Verde National Park in Colorado the same year, 1906. Not far from the Four Corners Monument, which is between Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. Now, 7 national parks were available for public use by 1906, and after the Antiquities Act was passed, another duo of parks would be brought into existence before the creation of the NPS via the enactment of the Organic Act. By August 1916, the Department of the Interior oversaw 14 national parks, 21 national monuments, and the hot springs and Casa Grande ruin reservations. I always want to say reservations. Reservations. Don't know what's wrong with me. But there was no unified leadership or organization to operate them. Lacking this, the parks and monuments were vulnerable to competing interests. With encouragement from future director Stephen T. Mather and Horace Albright, the National Geographic Society, journalists, railroad interest, and others, Congress passed what is often known as the Organic Act on August 25, 1916, which established the National Park Service and placed all the existing parks under its management. The legislation established the basis for the fundamental mission, philosophy, and policies of the National Park Service. The Organic Act secured this new conservation direction by creating a national park system with a resource protection goal. Just prior to the establishment of the Organic Act, Hawaii Volcano National Park and Lassen Volcanic National Park would be formed on August 1st and August 9th of 1916, respectively. The creation of the NPS pushed the idea and prospect of the national parks system into overdrive. Now, another 8 parks would take shape by 1930. Those are Denali in Alaska, Acadia in Maine, Grand Canyon in Arizona, Zion in Utah, Hot Springs in Arkansas, Bryce Canyon in Utah, Grand Teton in Wyoming, and Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico. Almost a third of America's 63 current national parks were now underway, up and running, receiving millions of visitors every year. A major reorganization within President Franklin Roosevelt, I want to say Delano Roosevelt, it just doesn't say it in my notes, but I want to say it, FDR. Major reorganization within President Franklin Roosevelt's executive branch in 1933 had a tremendous impact on the National Park Service. Specifically 2 executive orders effective August 10th, 1933, which transferred the War Department's parks and monuments to the National Park Service. In addition, the National Park Service received all the national monuments held by the Forest Service and the responsibility for virtually all monuments created thereafter. It also assumed responsibility for the parks in the nation's capital, which had previously been managed by a separate office in Washington. The reorganization was one of the most significant events in the evolution of the national park system. The service's holdings were greatly expanded, and there was now a single national system of parklands. With the 1933 reorganization and new responsibilities for historical areas, historic preservation became a primary mission of the National Park Service. 3 more parks would come to fruition, putting the total at 22 by 1935. The Everglades, alligator swampland, a humid hellhole down in Florida came to be in 1934, along with the Great Smoky Mountains the same year, and Virginia's Shenandoah would spring to life. The Great Smoky Mountains, a little fun fact here if you didn't know, has now become the national park with the highest average visitation annually, seeing over 13 million people every year, which is nearly 3 times as many as the second place park, the Grand Canyon, which sees somewhere just over 4 million. Just crazy to me. In 1935, the Historic Sites Act emerged from the National Park Service's desire to strengthen the legal foundation for its growing historical programs, how about that one? Along with a broader recognition of the need for more federal support for historic properties. The act declared a national policy to preserve for public use historic sites, buildings, and objects of national significance for the inspiration and benefit of the people of the United States. It assigned broad powers and duties, I almost said deputies the first time, to the Secretary of the Interior and the Service, to include conducting surveys of historic properties to determine which possess exceptional value as commemorating or illustrating U.S. history. They were authorized to conduct research, to restore, preserve, and maintain historic properties directly or through cooperative agreements with other parties, and to mark properties, establish and maintain related museums, and engage in other interpretive activities for public education. The legislation's provision for a historic site survey proved valuable in identifying potential additions to the national park system. So they'd have someone go out, actually visit different parts of the United States, different places with historic sites, quote unquote, and they would evaluate them to see if they were historic enough or had enough educational or historic purpose to be added to the system, to the NPS National Park System. World War II would put the brakes on establishing parks at such an expeditious rate. Only 5 parks would be built in the next 20 years, from 1935 to 1955, Olympic in 1938, Kings Canyon in 1940, Isle Royale, good old Michigan National Park. Actually, funny thing is, I live closer to Ann Arbor, Detroit in Michigan. From where I am sitting, I believe it is over 10 hours between driving and taking the ferry to get to Isle Royale. Just thinking about that. Over 10 hours in my own state. That's without leaving the state or anything. That's going up across the Mackinac, big old bridge up there, up to the UP, across the UP, and you're going to like Copper Harbor or something to sail out from way the fuck out there to Isle Royale, which is a little island out in Lake Superior. Lake Superior, definitely an interesting place. Also, Lake Superior would be a very interesting topic maybe for a Patreon episode, The Shadows, an episode in the shadows. Mammoth Cave would be established in 1941 and Big Ben in 1944. In 1937, Shenandoah would become the first national park to see more than 1 million visitors in a year. Following the war, things moved at a snail's pace. It would take a decade, but in 1956, Mission 66 was a 10-year program initiated by National Park Service Director Conrad L. Wirth, W-I-R-T-H, to upgrade facilities, staffing, and resource management throughout the system by the 50th anniversary of the service in 1966. Congress appropriated more than $1 billion over the 10-year period for Mission 66 improvements. The legacy of the program included dozens of visitor centers, hundreds of employee residences, as well as the Mather and Albright employee training centers at Harpers Ferry and the Grand Canyon. Also, the Virgin Islands National Park was established in 1956 on St. John, and by 1959, after the embargo of Americans on travel to Cuba, the U.S. Virgin Islands became a popular tourist destination, very popular by the end of the 1950s. Following the 1950s, a plethora of acts would be passed in the 1960s, alongside the organization of 6 more parks, putting the total at 34 by 1970. 1961 saw Haleakala arise in Hawaii. 1962 was the birth of the Petrified Forest as a national park in Arizona. And Canyonlands was taking shape in Utah in 1964, just as another act was about to be executed. In the Wilderness Act of 1964, Congress adopted a policy of securing wilderness areas for the benefit of present and future generations of Americans. It established a national wilderness preservation system to be composed of federally owned areas designated by Congress as wilderness areas that would be administered in a way that would leave them unimpaired for the use and enjoyment of the American people as wilderness areas. The legislation prompted the service to carefully examine all parkland that potentially qualified as wilderness areas and provided additional legal protection for park areas. In 1965, the Land and Water Conservation Fund Act, established a fund for acquiring new recreation lands within or adjacent to existing park units or new parks. Money for the fund would come from surplus property sales, motorboat fuel taxes, and other sources. A portion of the money in the fund would come from fees charged at existing parks. The fund was administered by the Bureau of Outdoor Recreation, a new interior bureau established in 1962. The legislation took away the Park Service's responsibility for recreational planning and assistance, together with some of its staff and fund, but the service later regained these functions, and when the Bureau reconstituted in 1978 as the Heritage Conservation and Recreation Service expired in 1981, they received them all back. In 1966, the 1966 National Historic Preservation Act required that all historical parks be entered in the National Register of Historic Places. National Park Service and other federal agency measures that would affect historic sites became subject to review by state historic preservation officers and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, a new federal agency established by the Act. Additionally, this year, Guadalupe Mountains National Park was created in Texas. Guadalupe Mountains, the national park, sees less than 250,000 people every year. Progressing forward, the Wild and Scenic River Act of 1968 provided the protection and preservation in free-flowing condition of selected rivers that possessed outstanding scenic, recreational, geologic, wildlife, historic, or cultural values. It identified 8 rivers and adjacent lands in 9 states as initial components of the Wild and Scenic River System to be administered variously by the Secretaries of Agriculture and the Interior. It also named 27 other rivers or river segments to be studied as potential additions to the Wild and Scenic River System. The legislation addition to the National Park System's long, winding units with complex The legislation added to the National Park System's long, winding units with complex management challenges. Also in 1968, the National Trails System Act provided for the establishment of both national recreation trails accessible to urban areas to be designated by the Secretary of the Interior and the Secretary of Agriculture according to specified criteria, and national scenic trails to be established by Congress. It designated 2 national scenic trails, and you could probably guess what they are, as initial components of the trail system: the Appalachian Trail on the east and the Pacific Crest Trail, the PCT, on the west. It also ordered 14 other routes to be studied for possible National Scenic Trail designation. Along with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, this legislation expanded This legislation expanded the diversity of units in the national park system. I had such a challenge saying diversity, and I don't know why. 1968 was a busy year in other ways, also seeing another pair of parks pop up: North Cascades in Washington and Redwoods in California. The Volunteers in the Parks Act of 1969 provided legislation that authorized the Secretary of the Interior to establish a Volunteers in the Park program to aid in interpretation functions or other visitor services or activities in and related to areas administered by the National Park Service. The legislation provided a vehicle that allowed the service to utilize volunteers, help, and services. The number of volunteers has consistently grown and has proven increasingly beneficial. Also in 1969, the National Environmental Policy Act formed the nation's basic charter for environmental protection. It directed federal agencies to carry out their functions in a way that avoided or minimized environmental degradation and required them to conduct planning with studies of potential environmental impacts for all development projects. In addition, the planning process would be open for public input. The new environmental legislation significantly increased the complexity of the service's resource management in the parks. The General Authorities Act of 1970 redefined the national park system to include all areas managed for park monument, historic, parkway, recreational, or other purposes by the National Park Service. This marked a change from earlier legislation in which Congress legally defined the national park system to exclude most areas in the recreational category. The legislation declared the various types of parks to be a single system. So they would continue to add to the system, and by 1971, Utah would see the introduction of its third and fourth national parks, being Arches and Capitol Reef. A few years ahead, in 1973, the Endangered Species Act would require federal agencies to ensure that their activities, authorized, funded, or executed, did not jeopardize the existence of any endangered or threatened species of plant or animal, including fish, or result in the destruction or deterioration of critical critical species habitats. It also provided for studies to determine endangered or threatened species and stipulates that it is unlawful for a person to possess, export, or import those species. This and other environmental legislations of the 1960s and 70s served to bolster the role of science in park management. Gotta love the hippies of the 1960s and 70s doing some good shit and protecting the nature, the animals, the beauty that is provided in this world. I always think about going, like out of the country and all this shit, and there's just so much beauty here in America, and so many places you can go without having to, spend thousands and thousands of dollars, without having to get a passport to do all this excessive planning. Don't get me wrong, going out of the country is great, but visit the places that are close to you to start. There's so much beauty here, so much beauty around everywhere, almost every state. Probably a few states that aren't as beautiful, but there's beauty here in America. Go fucking check it out. A single park would see itself come to fruition from 1972 to 1977, being Voyageurs National Park in far northern Minnesota, established in 1975. Looks like a beautiful park. Looks fucking gorgeous. Every time you look up pictures of it, it's just fucking northern lights. Northern lights, northern lights. Just so far, pretty much Canada. Beautiful place. I'm sure it'd be awesome to visit. Gotta make it there someday. Really, honestly, I'd love to make it to all the national parks and additional, places and monuments and areas within the park system. In the 1970s, Congress grappled with the problem of the encroachment upon parks by adjacent activities. The coastal redwoods in Redwood National Park were being threatened by logging activities outside the park boundaries. In 1978, Congress expanded the park boundaries to encompass the remaining watershed and protect the endemic ecosystem. The legislation was in effect a declaration encouraging the protection of national parks from external threats. In the same year, the nation would see the National Parks and Recreation Act, 1978 there. This act authorized the addition of 15 units to the national park system to include the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. In combination, the 38th and 39th national parks would be opened in South and North Dakota. Badlands and Theodore Roosevelt National Parks would open, showcasing amazing pieces of land within this section of the country. Not too many people are like, yeah, national park, let's go to South Dakota, North Dakota. But if you're into, kind of more of the western-y feel to a national park, it definitely has some, flatlands and really cool features to it, a lot of good rock formations, some crazy snakes and different animals there as well. So definitely a place to check out also. Haven't been to either of them, but would love to go. Looked into Theodore Roosevelt National Park when we were coming back from Glacier in 2021. Yeah, 2021. But did not end up stopping there, unfortunately. Glacier, fucking go check that one out. And I would actually like to see the northern part of that, too. It connects through the United States, over the border, into Canada, to Waterton Lakes. I've never been to that side, but it is a dual national park between the U.S. and Canada. That's Glacier. Definitely check that one out if you're ever up there or get the chance to. It's fucking gorgeous. The Archaeological Resources Protection Act of 1979, I don't know why it sounded like a German dude there. This legislation corrected more than 7 decades of inadequate protection for archaeological sites and objects. It superseded the Antiquities Act as the prime legislation protection for the federal archaeological resources by defining them more completely and establishing appropriate penalty provisions for the destruction or theft of them. In 1980, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act would be passed. The Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, way too long of a fucking name, added more than 47 million acres to the national park system, including Wrangell St. Elias, which is gigantic. 2 years earlier, President Jimmy Carter had proclaimed national monuments totaling 2 years earlier, President Jimmy Carter had proclaimed national monuments totaling roughly 45 million acres in Alaska, greatly expanding the national park system's services, land management responsibilities. The 1980 legislation sanctioned President Carter's actions and converted most of the national monuments in Alaska into national parks and preserves. This legislation more than doubled the size of the national park system and dramatically increased the total designated wilderness acreage. Wrangell St. Elias, like I said, is huge, is 13.2 million acres total, the largest national park, and just a little bit smaller than the state of West Virginia. All in all, this added 7 parks to the national park system. Another 2 would be added the same year as well, with Biscayne opening thousands and thousands of miles away in Florida, and the Channel Islands being added to the lineup down the Pacific coast in California. After the designation of national parks in Alaska, the rest of the 1980s would welcome a couple of additional parks. In 1986, we would see Great Basin National Park open its doors in Nevada. This would be Nevada's first. 2 years later, in 1988, the National Park of the American Samoa would be established. The American Samoa is an unincorporated territory of the United States located in the Polynesia region of the South Pacific Ocean, east of Australia and north of New Zealand. In 1990, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act would appear. Earlier legislations had expressly forbidden the excavation of Indian graves and removal of human and ceremonial remains. This act went further, directing museums to return native remains to the direct or at least cultural descendants for reburial. Compliance created some difficulties for museums, including those in the National Park Service. In 1992, hundreds of experts from within and outside the National Park Service participated in a conference to commemorate the service's 75th anniversary. They addressed the current status of the National Park management and made recommendations for the future. Their report, known as the Vail Agenda, addresses the status and needs of the national parks in the 21st century. The document reiterated the concerns expressed in the State of the Park Report from 1980 and the General Accounting Office Report from 1987. Among the recommendations was an urgent call for park management grounded in scientific research. But 1992 also welcomed the second Florida National Park. Dry Tortugas National Park, almost 70 miles west of Key West, was redesignated as a national park on October 26th of 1992. Dry Tortugas also contains Fort Jefferson. Fort Jefferson is a former U.S. military coastal fort. It is the largest brick masonry structure in the Americas, covering 16 acres and made with over 16 million bricks. At this point, over 50 national parks encompass the best of what the United States had to offer, but in the next 30 years, 12 more parks would be designated as such, the most recent being in 2020. Of these 12, a quarter of them would be settled in 1994. These 3 parks would all be located west of the Mississippi. Arizona would have Saguaro, Saguaro National Park, the Cactus National Park. In California, would see 2 national parks, Joshua Tree and Death Valley. Some craziness. Death Valley is the fucking furnace of the goddamn earth. Some craziness about Death Valley. The hottest air temperature ever recorded in Death Valley in a place called Furnace Creek, which is very fitting, was 134 degrees Fahrenheit. Fuck that shit. Let me tell you what, I like warm days. I don't mind a 90-degree day, all sunny and shit, but 134? Yeah, I don't give a fuck if there's no humidity. I don't care about any of that shit. 134 is too much. Too much. Too. Absolutely absurd. That temperature happened on July 10th of 1913 during the heat wave that peaked with that record 5 consecutive days reached 129 degrees or above. Fuck that shit. The National Park Omnibus Management Act of 1998 provided for improved management and increased accountability for certain National Park Service programs. It directed reform of the process by which areas are considered for addition to the National Park system. Specifically, the legislation provided that no study of the potential of an area for the inclusion in the National Park system be made without the specific authorization of Congress. The Omnibus Act, I don't know if it's omnibus or omnibus. The Omnibus Act also instituted the first legislative reforms of the service's concessions management practices in a generation. The service responded with new regulations and guidelines for concession contracts, commercial use authorization, and the use of franchise fees. It allowed the service to retain concession franchise fees in the parks in which they were collected. The year following the Omnibus Act would distinguish another park inside the bounds of Colorado, the Black Canyon of the Gunnison National Park. This would also be the last park designated in the 20th century. In the next quarter of a century, another 8 parks would pop up in 8 separate states. This started in 2000 with Cuyahoga Valley in Ohio and would see additions like Congaree in South Carolina in 2003, Great Sand Dunes in Colorado in 2004, and Pinnacles in California 9 years later in 2013. The development of the parks continues to grow while being as malleable as possible to flow with the ever-changing landscape of the humans that visit, along with tackling current and future problems, especially those associated with climate change. The most recently added parks to the National Park system include the Gateway Arch of Missouri, designated in 2018, Indiana Dunes in Indiana, designated in 2019, White Sands in New Mexico, right outside the White Sands missile testing grounds, White Sands in New Mexico in 2019, and New River Gorge in West Virginia in 2020. The history of the national parks and the National Park Service is a testament to the evolving understanding of conservation, public recreation, and historical preservation in the United States. From the establishment of Yellowstone in 1872, a groundbreaking step in land protection, to the significant expansions in legislative acts of the 20th century, the National Park system has grown in both scope and purpose. It has become a crucial mechanism for preserving natural wonders, wildlife, and cultural heritage for future generations. The role of pivotal figures, from early advocates like George Catlin to presidents like Theodore Roosevelt, and influential policies such as the Antiquities Act, underscores the enduring importance of federal stewardship. As the National Park Service continues to adapt to modern challenges, including environmental concerns like climate change, it remains a vital institution. The parks not only reflect America's natural and historical diversity, but also serve as a symbol of the nation's commitment to protecting its shared heritage. The growth of the National Park system over the years ensures that the treasured lands will continue to inspire and benefit people for generations to come. All right. A lot of information that we just packed in there. All All right, though, before we kind of put it all into a cohesive little segment, before we hop over to today's main marks, let's talk about some mysteries and weird happenings. Instead of just, a lot of historical stuff, let's talk about some weird things that happened in a couple of these parks. First off, let's talk about the dope plane. Dope plane, yeah, of 1977. In the winter of 1977, Yosemite National Park became the unlikely setting for a tale that blurred the lines between adventure and illegality. 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 Fucking hate words. Two waiters from the Awani Hotel, emboldened by a severe drought that had reduced snow levels, ventured deep into the park on a snowshoeing trip, dropping LSD. Yeah, some acid. I'm not a huge fan of acid. I like mushrooms a little bit more. Everyone has their preference, though. Dropping LSD just for good measure. And oh boy, what a trip they would have. They stumbled upon a Howard 500 aircraft, crashed and abandoned, with a cargo that was far from ordinary. 6,000 pounds of Mexican marijuana. Good old brickweed. Love it. Might have been better back in the 70s, though. Probably not, though. The initial discovery by the servers triggered a complex operation involving multiple federal agencies as the site turned into a crime scene. Despite efforts to salvage the soggy, frozen marijuana and secure the area, the lake's remote location and icy conditions thwarted immediate recovery of the plane's further contents or its deceased occupants. As word of the abandoned stash spread, climbers and park locals, known affectionately as dirtbags, seized the opportunity. I love that. Dirtbags, fucking assholes going to pick out some weed, some dirt weed, Mexican dirt weed from the goddamn plane that crashed. You bastards. Dirtbags. They turned the site into what was dubbed as Dope Lake. Using ice axes and later chainsaws, they mined the frozen lake for marijuana. This led to an improvised gold rush where climbers could make significant sums from selling the salvaged marijuana despite its comprised quality due to water and jet fuel contamination. Holy shit. Here, smoke this fucking weed that's damp as fuck, so it weighs way too much. Yeah, that's an ounce right there. It's like a quarter. And it's also covered in jet fuel, so you'll get fucking stoned. Let me tell you what, it's good. It's that fire. It might catch on fire, like actually catch on fire. This bizarre episode peaked when Rangers dubbed Danger Rangers, ooh, yeah, conducted a raid in April 1977 to shut down the operation. Remarkably, despite the scale of the activity, only 2 individuals were ever arrested, and those charges were subsequently dropped due to a legal technicality. The event has since been immortalized in climbing culture and is a vivid example of the unexpected stories that national parks can tell. The events have since been immortalized in climbing culture and is a vivid example of the unexpected stories that national parks can tell. Number 2, did you know between 240 and 250 people die annually at America's national parks and sites? This number is not incredibly high by any means and does encompass all of the NPS's locations, which is parks, monuments, recreation areas, etc., all the other ones. But it is still wild to think about. Most people can likely imagine how most of these deaths occur, but it's still shocking to read about some of the horrible ways people meet their ends. Men are more likely to perish in the national park system than women, with around 80% of these deaths accounted for by the male population that visits. Of all deaths, over half of them are filed under the causings of death. All deaths are only half of them are filed under the causes. I'm so stupid. Of all deaths, over half of them are filed under the causes of drowning, motor vehicle crashes, and medical purposes like heart attacks, stroke, etc. Etc. Fucking ect. It's not ek. It's etc. With nearly another quarter of them happening due to falls or suicides. Don't commit suicide. You're all great. You're all fucking wonderful people. Go get some help if you need it. I understand it completely. I struggle struggle a lot with mental health, and I advocate people to talk to someone, to see someone, to figure out what they can do to better themselves and make their lives better for themselves. Including all fatalities, 97% happened with people who were 15 years of age or older. So young teenagers and little kids generally don't die, but it does happen. Many people attribute the danger of death highly with parks such as Lake Mead Recreation Area or the Grand Canyon. But in terms of deaths per 10 million visitors, the true most deadly park is North Cascades National Park in Washington. Crazy, right? With a staggering 601.73 deaths per 10 million visitors. Over 6 times higher than the next closest, which is Denali in Alaska. Denali is a fucking crazy place. It gets so cold up there. People try to climb the mountains up there and die every year. It's absurd. It blows my mind that North Cascades has as many deaths as it does, since it does not see so many visitors, that many visitors. Though North Cascades has a low annual visitation rate, with just over 40,000 people visiting every year, it seems that if you visit, you have a much higher likelihood of coming face to face with death. And lastly, long one before we hop into our main marks, the severed hand found in Yosemite in 1983. Yosemite is a crazy place. Lots of stuff going on there. Actually, it was a severed hand and forearm, but still, a severed hand and forearm were recovered from Yosemite National Park during the summer of 1983. The remains were severely decomposed and animal predation was also likely. The remains were estimated to have been at the scene since approximately 1982. Examination suggested the arm and hand belonged to a petite adult female, although this was not definite. By 1988, a skull that also belonged to an adult female was discovered near the original scene, and it was presumed that they belonged to the same person. Patricia Marie Patty Hicks Dahlstrom, born June 1st, 1954, was the woman who was located at Yosemite National Park in 1983. Additional remains were found in 1988, as I said. She was identified with the assistance of Parabon Nanolabs at the end of April 2021, but her identity was not released at that time per her family's request. Hicks' identity was eventually released on the Hulu series Wild Crime on October 26th of 2022. Hicks last contacted family in September of 1982 after relocating to Merced, California from Washington. She had joined a religious following, the San Anda Apostolic Church, founded by Donald Gibson, believed to have been motivated by the trauma she suffered surrounding the suicide of her brother, is why she joined. She also had a short-lived marriage to a former high school friend, divorcing in 1974. Other close friends stated her personality to have changed significantly after these events, and described her to be vulnerable and likely to misplace trust after having these occurrences. The group has been described as a cult. Residents of Merced reported having unfavorable opinions of Gibson and those associated with him. Allegedly, members were recruited based on attractiveness, and the males at least, with the added bonuses of drugs and sex. Of course, everyone loves a good orgy party, a good sex party, some drugs to go with that, make it a little nicer. I think the women were probably interested in some of that as well. Some of the women, at least. Additional accounts of activities included arranged marriages and sexual rituals. Most members refused communication with law enforcement and documentary filmmakers. Additionally, Hicks' surviving family members opted out of appearing in the Wild Crime documentary where she was identified. The victim's identity was withheld until the season was released in October of 2022. In 1980, several members of the San Anda group were arrested, including Hicks. A probe into the religious organization began after 3 underage males informed police that Donald Gibson had given them LSD and at least one had been sexually assaulted while unconscious upon first meeting the leader of this community. First time he meets these fucking people, takes some LSD, let me molest you. Terrible fucking dude. Might be an interesting one to look into, though. Love me some cult shit. You never know. We'll have to check them out and see if they're worth doing an episode on Donald Gibson and his stupid fucking cult. Gibson was tried the following September and convicted of 4 sexual offenses by early October. It is believed that many of his followers remained loyal out of fear or by manipulation. The prosecuting attorney described him to be capable of violence against someone who betrayed him. Gibson subsequently jumped bail following his conviction to avoid being sentenced. He has never been located since. Actually, if you look up Donald Gibson's name, Donald Eugene Gibson is his whole name, the first thing that pops up is his Boy Scouts sexual abuse page. So you know he's a great dude. Never been located. Members of the investigation have expressed concern of his being involved in Hicks' death, whether directly or by proxy. After Gibson went on the run, Hicks made the decision to leave the area to the dismay of her unnamed roommate of several years, who also belonged to the religious following. The roommate had become close to the victim during the time they spent together. The witness believed Hicks planned on taking public transportation to the park, where her remains were later found, but the specific location to which she intended to arrive was never confirmed. Crazy stuff. All right, we've tackled a lot of information today. We visited so many different national parks, talked about the beautiful outdoors, been to so many different places in this beautiful country, this amazing, gorgeous, fucking wonderful place, and talked about some horrible occurrences that happened in these areas. I'd say it's about time we finally wrap things up with those main marks. Number 1, in 1832, George motherfucking Carlin. Yeah, George Carlin, famous comedian. No. George Catlin. George Catlin, yes, he's a cat. Catlin, that is, was the first to advocate for protecting natural areas and indigenous culture. Inspired by his travels in the American West, his vision would come to reality 40 years later in 1872. Number 2, the Yellowstone National Park Act established Yellowstone National Park in 1872 and created the United States as well as the world's first national park. This act would springboard a national park movement around the world. Now, over 100 countries have national parks within their borders. Number 3, in 1916, the Organic Act established the National Park Service and placed all the existing parks under its management. This is the NPS that we have come to know today. Number 4, California holds the title as the state with the most national parks, with a whopping 9 total parks in its jurisdiction. The second place state would be Alaska with 8, followed by Utah in third with 5. Number 5, Alaska gained its statehood on January 3rd of 1959, and Hawaii was granted its statehood the same year on August 21st. Each of these states had a single national park within their boundary for over 40 years before officially becoming a state. Hawaii Volcanoes National Park was formed in 1916, and the following year saw Denali designated in Alaska. A bonus mark today. Extra. Number 6, new information. Something I didn't talk about today very much, and you may already know, but the creation of the United States national parks had a devastating impact on indigenous peoples who were forcibly removed from their homelands and experienced cultural genocide. The establishment of national parks led to the displacement of indigenous people from their ancestral lands, which they had valued for generations. Terrible fucking part of our history in the United States. For example, the Tukadika or sheep-eater Shoshone people were relocated to a reservation in Wyoming after Yellowstone became the world's first national park. Treaty rights to traditional uses of the land, such as hunting and fishing, were often erased without compensation or acknowledgement. For example, the Blackfeet people saw their treaty rights abrogated when Glacier National Park was established in 1910. Tensions over the sacred lands within national parks have persisted for decades and in some cases remain ongoing. Native Americans have experienced near cultural genocide as a result of the United States expansions. Some organizations, such as the National Park Foundation, the NPF, are working to address this history and strengthen the relationship between indigenous people and national parks. The NPF's programs include education, storytelling, internships, and tribal consultations. Horrible what has been done to the natives throughout history, a blatant and unjust mistreatment. I didn't touch on this subject much today, but it is a serious problem that still has its hold within today's parks and national areas. With those main marks tackled though, let's head into our final takeaways and get on out of here. Yeah. All right. Shit. Jeez. There's so much going on today. So much information. So much history. So much crazy fucking bullshit going on. Love the national parks. Terrible what we've done. What's been done to people, especially the natives throughout history. Especially anyone who's not, pretty much a white white person throughout history, because fucking the white people are terrible, gross people. The national parks of the United States are gorgeous pieces of nature set aside for the use of the public for outdoor activities like hiking, climbing, fishing, kayaking, and so much more. The beauty of these national parks is unmatched, and each one has its own story to be told. Over 90 million people visit the parks annually, over a quarter of the U.S.'s population, though a lot of these people are not, that visit the parks are not people from the United States. A lot of foreign visitors come in and visit these parks just to see them, to see the beauty that America has to offer. The unfortunate side is that many of these parks, especially the earliest ones, are riddled with claims of ethnic cleansing and cultural erasure to become established. Sites like Yellowstone and Yosemite saw indigenous people purged from their lands. The misled and misinformed mass of the United States only saw the glory of the natural wonders, waterfalls, cliffs, and wildlife. They missed the miraculous people who treated the land so magnificently for years. Nowadays, the parks are more highly touted for their marvelous wonders of natural, historical, and geographical origin. Let's embrace what many of the parks mean to those who visit. A wild, extravagant landscape that provides an escape, usually, from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Take a moment to truly relax. Take some deep breaths, take a walk in the woods, or in a quiet place, do some meditation, take a shit ton of psychedelic mushrooms, smoke a bunch of weed, and just enjoy life. It's the most we can do with the time that we have. Now though, with things all wrapped up, the national park history all behind us, let me make things a lot worse for you. Do you hate flying? I kind of fucking hate flying. I really, terrified of it sometimes. Let me make that terrible for you as we dive into the plane crash of Flight 401, an Eastern Airlines flight traveling from JFK in New York to Miami International in Miami, Florida in 1972. The plane experienced an insignificant instrument malfunction, and the resulting reactions doomed the flight, less than 20 miles from its final destination. So what happened? Why did it happen? And what resulted from this tragedy? We will take a look at the flight, the crash, the rescue, the survivors, and the aftermath of this air disaster. Oh, and possibly a haunting or two. So get ready, it's a wild one, and I'm ready to tell you. Beyond that, I want to say thank you so much for joining me today. Please go over and rate the show. Give it 5 stars if you haven't yet. I would love to hear from you. Tell me something about yourself. Give me a review. Give me a rating. Thank you so much for those who do. 5 stars truly helps the show get more recognition, and I appreciate them more than words can describe. Also, please recommend the show to your friends. The word of mouth is more powerful than any marketing tool, any rating or review. putting the show in front of another person and presenting it to them, or letting them listen and, giving them the idea of coming back to listen to more is awesome. I appreciate anyone who's done that also, recommended it to anyone, your families, your friends, some random person you walk by on the street, someone out in traffic, going to McDonald's, tell the person that you want a Whopper and to check out this. Yeah, tell them, first thing, go into McDonald's and tell them you want a Whopper, see how that turns out. But also, tell them to listen to my show. Tell them to listen to Beneath the Shadows every week on Sunday, new episode weekly, near an hour long, probably a little over. These recent episodes have been fucking lengthy. So tell them to check it out. I really, really appreciate you guys. Beyond that, there is also social media up, Instagram, TikTok, and Patreon. Patreon has shorter 15 to 20 minute episodes released bi-weekly on Thursdays. The next one will be coming out this Thursday, the 24th. But once again, thank you. Thank you so much for joining me for today's episode. I am Travis Fenn, and this has been Beneath the Shadows. Embrace your Sunday, everyone, and have a great week, my shadow people. Peace.
Bow, wow, wow. Bow, wow.